Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. So today, Chris Wilson did an interview with streamers Mathil and Zizaran. Mathil and Zizaran are two of the biggest names in Path of Exile streaming, and they'd been going out of their way to just try and get as many different opinions, questions that were being frequently asked around the community as they could, and raise them to Chris. I think they did a good job of asking questions, sometimes based on their own personal opinions, sometimes based on things that they thought other people were asking a lot. And this interview is worth your while watching in its entirety, but if you want to just have my thoughts on it, then that's what this video is about. Fair warning, this might go a little bit long. My first attempt at recording this, I sort of stopped realising it was 3/4 of an hour in. I didn't want to make it that long, so I'm going to condense it a bit, but there's a lot to cover. So firstly, there was a question of 3.15 and build diversity. Now, this really came down to a philosophical question of what is build diversity in the meta. So a lot of the discussion focused on Spellslinger. So the meta reflects public perceptions of build power, not necessarily actual power. So build popularity is a big factor here. You can see if you look at the price history of the unique item Garakan's Flight during last league, so Ultimatum, it exploded on one particular day. I think it might have been the 17th of June, when a streamer put out a build that used the item, and the price went from 50 chaos to 750 chaos overnight. This wasn't that Garakan's Flight got better on that day, it was that the public perception of the item got better, and it was a key piece in a build that was quite successful, and so that caused its price to explode. So, the Path of Exile community currently thinks that Spellslinger is dumpster tier. However, I don't think this is true. The first kill of a Shaper Guardian that took place in softcore trade enabled in 3.15 was actually a Spellslinger character. There's a video that you can that I will link down in the description of the video below. It's 130-second time to kill. This is a rare Guardian of the Phoenix fight with Maven Witness on a character level 85. Now, I think the fact that a player can do the Phoenix in 2 minutes and 10 seconds on dumpster tier gear. I think they said that even at league start they'd only spent 9 chaos on their character. That indicates that that build is completely fine. And 0.6% of players are playing Spellslinger. Now, a lot of people consider 0.6%, especially for a skill that was meta in the past. Like I have a feeling that Spellslinger's been 15% plus in the past. That 0.6% is perceived as unhealthy. Actually, there's so many skills in the game that that they can't actually all be as high as 0.6%. Even if there was perfect balance, like if every skill was equally popular, you'd end up with about 0.3% for each skill because there's so many skills. So my takeaway here is that I think 0.6% take-up is pretty healthy. It's not cause for concern. What is the problem is when you either exceed 20%, which Spectral Shield Throw is sort of getting close to at the moment, or you're under about 0.1, 0.05%. That's when it's a bit of a problem. That's when a skill is clearly either over or underperforming. Numbers in 3.15 aren't perfect, but I actually think they're pretty good. There's a lot of people doing even really hard content like the Feared on a bunch of builds like Soul Rend, for instance. Soul Rend is being played by less than 0.1% of players this league, and yet there is still someone who's done the Feared on it. I do think that the build diversity situation would be a bit better if some of the top performing outliers were nerfed. So Spectral Shield Throw being one example, and also Forbidden Right totems. But they don't need massive sweeping nerfs. They're not in the broken situation that, say, in Legion League Cyclone was in. However, something that wasn't mentioned in this discussion is that low-end ascendancies are genuinely in a bad spot. This didn't come up, but I think Inquisitor, Chieftain, Trickster, Champion, Juggernaut, and Pathfinder are not doing well anywhere. Not in any of the main game modes, so Trade-enabled Softcore, Trade-enabled Hardcore, Solo Self-found Softcore, Solo Self-found Hardcore. And Juggernaut in particular is in a terrible place, where it's worse than Gladiator in both defense and damage, and the only real reason to consider playing a Juggernaut at the moment is accuracy stacking shenanigans, which is a very niche build. There's a later comment, though, that Chris Wilson makes I think is really important on build diversity, and this is really referring to undiscovered builds or unpopular builds that are genuinely good. So Chris says, there's a perception that when we nerf a skill that it's dead. That's not what we're trying to do. When we adjust a skill, we want it to be in a good place. Theoretically, if we nerf a skill, it should still be played. The perception with players is that once it's nerfed, it's not worth playing. We don't get this right all the time, but when we look at the top builds that we look at, it's a random assortment of skills that we have nerfed in the past ages ago. People should be more willing to give skills a try after we've nerfed them. Really agree with this, and we've seen this a few times in the past where a skill has been sort of sleeper OP for a long time. People have just forgotten it because it was better than it, it sort of had been a top meta skill, it'd been nerfed, and then suddenly it comes back. You're sort of seeing a bit of a resurgence of Winter Orb in recent leagues. Winter Orb was probably one of the most, when we're talking about metas that were not diverse at all, the Betrayal League and then the Synthesis League, Winter Orb was the top overperformer in those leagues. It got nerfed really, really hard. Everyone wrote it off as dead, and yet it's still seeing a moderate amount of play, and was one of the solid builds of 3.13 and 3.14. So I don't know where it is now, but it has been quite good quite a lot of the time. So ultimately, I personally think build diversity is in a fine spot at the moment. I think it's in a better spot than it was in 3.13 or 3.12 or 3.11, 3.10, whilst not as good as it was in 3.14 or 3.9. But ultimately, there's going to be different opinions on that. But that's basically just from looking at the data and looking at the people who are beating the hardest content in the game on a variety of builds. There was a bunch of discussion of Flasks, and Chris said he's pretty happy with the changes that were made to the Instilling Orb situation in 3.15.2, but less so with some of the rest of the system, and he's holding out for more feedback post 3.15.2. So this is 3.15.2 enabled you to set whatever trigger condition you wanted on a Flask through the Instilling Orb bench crafts. This requires you to beat Act 10, and then you'll be able to get this by going to Oriath, or if you've killed Cirrus, then going to the Karui Shores and getting the movement speed craft. That movement speed craft also has all of these Flask enchant crafts with it, and these will provide provide you with a lot of flexibility with Flasks. However, he's holding for more opinions after 3.15.2. Now that you can do things like have a Flask trigger. A Flask that's got of heat on it, you can have it to trigger when you get frozen. Things like that have come up. He wants to give it a bit of a test run, and then after that, reassess things as needed. He doesn't want to introduce changes that might be impossible to walk back later, such as allowing Flask macros. There's a bunch of discussion that came up about, we've just sort of lost our place here. A bunch of discussion that came up about chase items and different philosophies people have. These are actually counterposed, and I don't think this is obvious. So there's people who want chase items to be an oh wow moment. You're mapping normally, and boom, there's a Mirror of Kalandra drop. Versus people that want deterministic progress. And I think the best example of deterministic progress is leveling a gem just up to 20. That it's going to be like 220 maps, and then your gem will be level 20. Then there's mechanics like Divination Cards that are somewhere in the middle, where it's each individual card is a little bit of an oh wow moment, but also feels a little bit more, not quite deterministic, but semi-deterministic progress, and it does sort of smooth out the variance a lot. So for instance, if Chevron's Wrappings was one per 100 maps. It's rarer than 1 per 100 maps. It's probably 1 per 2,000 or so. But let's just say it was 1 per 100. And the Divination card, the offering, was 1 per 12.5. You would get a Chevron's Wrappings once per 100 maps just through normal farming. But if you didn't, you'd also have the chance to get it through the Divination card. However, you would also have this situation where the variance would be much higher on just having the Chevron's Wrappings drop outright. So if you got unlucky, if you were in the unluckiest 3% of players, then you would be looking at waiting about 320 maps to get your Chevron's Wrappings without the div cards. Whereas the unluckiest 3% of players with the Divination card approach would probably only take 150 or 170 maps. And so you can see how there's this Divination card smooth variance without eliminating it entirely. For contrast, leveling a gem to 20 is pretty much always 220 maps or so. So the Divination cards are somewhere in the middle there. Now, Diablo 2 had an interesting precedent that it set, which is that some bosses had biases towards some specific drop anywhere uniques and drop anywhere items in general. And Zizaran and Mathil sort of outlined some sort of desire to see something like this in the game, and particularly for mini-boss items like Brass Dome, which is what used to be a Guardian of the Minotaur exclusive drop, to return to their mini-bosses. I think with the mini-boss items, there's a little bit of a danger there, and that is that every time that there's multiple drops from a boss, one of them ends up being the thing that's sought after. Now, this is a trade league perspective here. One of them ends up being the driving reason for people to do that content. And you see this if you look at the Elder fight and also look at the Shaper fight. The Shaper fight, people are running it because they want their fragments to get into Uber Elder. So that's the driving factor, and it causes the prices of all of the Shaper's uniques to crater. On the flip side, the Elder fight, which is of comparable difficulty to complete, comparable difficulty to access to the Shaper fight, but the Elder fight works a little bit differently in that you have Watcher's Eye is the primary reason people are doing it. And that means that the Elder's fragments to get into Uber Elder are actually very cheap in trade leagues because people are buying these Elder Guardian sets in order to try and get a good Watcher's Eye. And so ultimately most of the value goes towards one of the drops. If you would have a situation where the Brass Dome was returned to the Minotaur, then, which I'm fine with this, but I do think there is a consequence, which is that the item will probably become worthless because people will be farming the fragment of the Minotaur, and they will get Brass Domes as a waste product of that farming, and then they will flood the market with them. So that's something to keep in mind, but I do still think I'm for that change anyway. It's just that it will have its drawbacks. Divination cards was the next thing that came up in discussion, and something I didn't realise is that they've stopped selling commissions for them. So I must have got one of the last ones with the Price of Prescience, which was commissioned somewhere around June or July of last year. So Mathil mentioned that he doesn't know where most of them drop. And that's because a lot of them are just so rare that they are basically non-existent in normal play, or that they drop from under quite obscure circumstances. Now, Chris mentioned he's happy with mid-band ones. Now, he referenced Humility, which I would have considered one of the more common divination cards, but ultimately that's what he was talking about there. Thought of it as being a mid-band one. Now, my opinion here is that ultimately, well, divination cards serve 2 or 3 real purposes. The first one is Trade League exclusive, and that is to add more copies of specific items into a Trade League economy. The second one is also very much Trade League specific, and it is to create weird and wonderful treasures that otherwise would not exist in a Trade League. And a lot of the 2 Implicit Corrupted divination cards are a good example of this. It's things like the divination card. My favourite divination card of them all is Arrogance of the Vile. It's a divination card set of 8 for a 2 Implicit Corrupted unique item. Random unique. You get a lot of things like a 2 Implicit Corrupted Prism Weave. No one's going to 2 Implicit Corrupted Prism Weave in normal play, but it can make something that's just a cool little toy that will exist in a trade league that may or may not be valuable to someone. So I like those sorts of cards, but that's me as a trade league player. Then there's solo self-found players who love the cards that make it so they can deterministically farm a build-empowering item. A good example of this would be the divination card for the unique wand Obliteration, or for that matter, Humility is another example as well. So I feel like GGG should give a serious thought to reassigning all of the drop locations. Make it so that players that start getting stuck in progression somewhere, when there's an item that would help them out that's not beyond the that's not beyond their ability to acquire as it stands. Say for instance, Obliteration is a good example here. If that's going to be something that would help a player who's struggling with 2 Watchstone maps to break into 3 Watchstone maps, then that's the sort of item that should drop in 2 Watchstone maps. Not necessarily saying that all of them should be done like that. Additionally, they should be transparent about the drop locations of most cards and just publish that information, whilst leaving a couple of dozen chase cards as secret locations. I think that premium cards should be reassigned to hard content. So things like the Feared, or for instance, I was thinking about the divination card, the Fiend, which is a 1/11th of a corrupted headhunter with 1 Val implicit. That'd be the sort of thing that instead of having it drop from Shrine Map, where the drop rate has to be extraordinarily low, you could then put it with, say, Maven's Invitation, the Forgotten, and that would be something that would be a cool reward for target farming that content. You don't only target farm that in Trade League, but that's ultimately, some divination cards are just not for SSF, and that's one of them. Stacked decks, though, cause a bit of a problem. And my opinion is that these should not drop cards at league start until the card has dropped naturally in that league. Mathil and Zizaran were talking about different things. They didn't propose any solutions. They're just saying that it felt cheap that most of the best of the, most of the boss uniques, the first ones that exist come from people people who are savvy traders, just sniping all of the cards from them that have come from stack decks. So I think that they should tone down stack deck drops as well. And my thought of the goal here is that 20% of Saints treasure cards, so that's the one that's 1/10 of 2 Exalted Orbs, that 20% of them come from stack decks and 80% come from players target farming maps that drop it. So I want to talk about boss drops that came up next, and this overlaps a lot with the last topics. Zizaran raised a really good point, which is by the time I can kill Uber Atsuri, I have something better than Atsuri's Disfavor already. Now, Disfavor is an extreme outlier and is likely to be looked at urgently, but Chris's progression vision was that players would start with white and blue items, quickly upgrade to uniques and mediocre rares, and then eventually upgrade past uniques back to top-end rares, but rares that are crafted with top-end boss consumables like Maven Orbs. I kind of like this progression outline, so that in this sort of world, something like Atsuri's Disfavor would be better than most realistically craftable rares, but not better than the ones that can be crafted using top-end, mostly boss source consumables. I somewhat disagree with points that are made in this section asserting that Maven items are trash. Viridi's Veil is top tier this league. Despite being common, it's still valuable. The belts are all at least okay, and there is a use for Doppelganger's Guise. I think the thing with the Maven is that where we were talking earlier when we were talking about the Guardian of the Minotaur and the various mini-boss items, that all of the focus goes on one particular drop. The best thing the Maven drops is the Maven Orb. People who are chasing the Maven Orbs end up producing a lot of the Maven uniques as basically waste products of their farming, and that's a major factor that is going to suppress the price of the uniques there. The only bosses, really the only boss I can think of that doesn't have this problem is Cyrus. Cyrus manages to have a lot of value both in the Awakened Orbs, in the Awakener Orbs, and also in the Awakened Skill Gems, and also has the Hands of the High Templar, which is interesting in that it's an item that 1 in 32 of them ever ends up getting 5 Vaal Implicits. 31 in 32 of them, assuming that you do keep feeding Vaals at it until it bricks, 31 in 32 of them end up getting bricked, whereas only that 1 in 32 ends up being the 5 Vaal Implicit monster that item has the potential of being. There was a comment made that was sort of missed by a lot of people, that the Maven's endgame days are numbered with 3.17. So I'll miss the Maven. I've liked the Maven. I prefer her to Cirrus, definitely. I think she's sort of up there with Uber Elder among the better fights in the game. Some people don't like her, but I hope that she does stay around and stays prevalent at endgame. And I definitely hope that the Maven 4-way and 5-way, the Uncharted invitations, that they remain relevant in some way in the future, because they've been a lot of fun. There was also some talk that Awakened Gems may be buffed soon at level 5, so we'll have to see what that means. One thing that did come up in discussion that, that I think would be quite interesting, that there was some discussion that the Maven should drop items that have got an elevated mod on them. I think this would be cool. I also think that Cirrus should drop double influence scoured items, just as crafting bases. Most of the time, these wouldn't be very good, but there's just that potential for them to be something that's really cool that would come up. And again, it's just creating things, little toys for crafters that probably otherwise wouldn't exist, because the consumables you need to invest to create them are too valuable to use that way. So there's a bit of discussion about crafting, harvest, and hard mode that came up. And I wasn't expecting to bundle these 3 things together, but they do need to be, because Chris's vision is that hard mode will be watched for data on how much of a gap there should be between crafting's power and the power of items that drop on the ground, with a view that the core game will offer more power to both of them, but they're going to go for the same sort of gap that winds up being best in hard mode. As for hard mode, for those of you that missed the original discussion of it in the Bayclast episode, it's basically going to be Path of Exile, but with extreme stinginess on items, and with most of the powerful deterministic crafting options removed. It'll be a completely optional setting that Chris does not expect many people to play. But as he says, he is not concerned with the number that play it. There's no harm to deploy it. It's just an alternate league flag. We are not expecting the average player to jump in, and it's a mode where you can't do all content. I think you'll find that hard mode will not be fun for most players. It'll be something that'll be there for people like me that have more fun when they are failing content than when they're beating it. But the item starvation that we're going to see in the hard mode is not going to be the new normal. There's a bit of discussion about the rarity of harvest crafts, and ultimately I don't want to sort of flog a dead horse here or discuss it too much, except to say the things that are new. Ultimately, everyone's got an opinion on harvest by now. I find the game more fun without it because I find that when you're harvest geared, you need to trade for content, and you spend 2/3 of the time trading for 100% delirious maps and scarabs and sextants and Cirrus Watchstones and stuff like that, and much less time actually killing monsters. So that's why I find that harvest was a fun killer for me. Other people prefer that style of play, so obviously they're going to prefer harvest as it used to be. Without going through that all, though, Ashabi may be made more common, and discussion was made of soulbound rewards. So this is items that you can't trade. POE does have soulbound rewards. I disagree with Chris that they don't exist. Experience points are the main one. And so I sort of thought, and also there's like, niff-naff and trivia like divine vessels that are filled and stuff like that. The Legion 5-way map unlock, that's not character bound, that's account bound, but it's still an example of something that is soul bound. These sorts of things are, like basically Chris was saying he doesn't like the idea of trying to balance a harvest through soul binding, that it's something that he just feels is so far removed from where Path of Exile should be, but ultimately people aren't all going to agree on that. That's just the situation as he's got it at the moment. That's his opinion at the moment. So one thing that came up that I wasn't really expecting was Chris at one point says that he plans for Ultimatum and Expedition to probably go core at some point with improvements, and that they're likely to remove 2 leagues at that point to address some of the content bloat in the game. Now, earlier he'd mentioned that he didn't see Prophecies being in the game for a long time. So if you put 1 and 2 together, obviously you get that Prophecies are likely to be on the chopping block soon. And I don't think it takes a genius to see what the worst other league in the game is at the moment. That is definitely Torment. So those two look like they're likely to go in the short to medium term. And Prophecies are in a weird place at the moment. There's a cool concept there of here's a random quest, but I think there's too much variance between, on the one hand, the trivial quest to use a whetstone, and then on the other hand, the sort of more epic quest chains of a sort. Like they're not particularly difficult. They're an interesting little endgame thing. But like the things where you go and chase down one of the various Pale Council members, get their key, then ultimately go and fight the Pale Council itself. One thing though that's gated behind Prophecy at the moment is metamods. And metamods, for those of you that haven't done any advanced crafting, these are one of the most extreme top 0.1% player mechanics in the game, and they're currently tied to Prophecy chains. They're not so much their introduction, but the widespread knowledge of how to use them was the thing that pushed Exalt price from about 65 Chaos during the Essence League to the current prices where they typically hit about 150 during leagues, sometimes even breaking through 200. I think it was Harvest League they broke through 200. Now, the reason that this has changed over time is that when the metamods were changed to be gated behind Prophecies, which was in at 3.5, they became much more accessible than they'd been in the past. Prior to that, there was a horrible grind to unlock these metamods. And for those of you that aren't familiar, metamods are 5 specific crafting bench mods. One is cannot roll attack mods, one is cannot roll caster mods, one is item can have up to 3 crafted modifiers, one of them is your prefixes cannot change, and the other one is your suffixes cannot change. It's the prefixes can't change and suffixes can't change, the ones that are responsible for all of this. And they're one of the most extreme rich get richer mechanics in the game. I would be happy to see them go entirely, as there's something that really just that extends the lead of these players over everyone else in the trade economy. That said, if they do stay, I hope that they are somewhere that is, that's less of a hassle, like less of a grind to unlock, more about doing challenging content than doing trivial content lots of times. And additionally, I think that they should be denominated in different currency orbs to each other. So currently, of the metamods, all of them except for one cost pure Exalted Orbs. The other one costs 5 Blessed Orbs. I think it would be good to see one of them in Exalts, one in Annuls, one in Divines, and then the other two can be in whatever. I think that would be a much better system. And I think multi-mod, given that it's been nerfed a bit in the past, multi-mod would be interesting to see if that were to be costed in Regal Orbs. Give Regal Orbs a bit of a use. They're one of the rarer currency orbs. They're not particularly good at the moment. But that's my opinion anyway. I certainly would be happy to see metamods in general go. Maybe keeping multi-mod around because they just have so many broken interactions that require extreme knowledge to work out and require a lot of outer game resources as well. So you can't use these effectively or efficiently unless you are very familiar with the website POEDB, which data mines all of the information out of the game files, and all sorts of external databases. So this sort of bleeds into some discussion of deterministic crafting that came up. But basically the main thing, there wasn't anything much that was particularly new here, other than that Chris Wilson thinks that deterministic crafting needs a place in the game, not as powerful as it was in Harvest, and that it should be something that's, that's available to some extent, and that they don't want to see a situation where you can deterministically craft items that are 10 out of 10. Now, my thoughts on this, obviously, ultimately, my opinions aren't all that important, but I think that deterministic crafting should cap out at pretty much at solid items. Good enough to, say, beat Shaper Guardians in 30 seconds, but not good enough to kill top bosses in less than 1 second. Harvest was less than 1 second. That was what Harvest was doing, and if you weren't using your crafts to make items that were that good, then the most powerful use for them was to funnel them up to someone who could, to go and sell them instead. But that said, the best items in the game will always come from RNG layers, even in Harvest, where you did have that sort of mirror tier item factories, if you like. The top items were still started as Harvest Crafts, and then were finished by a very lucky hit of the Double Corruption Chamber. So there'll always be a use for RNG as a final layer on items. There was a little bit of discussion of Ashling, and I think that Zizaran in particular thought that Ashling is too weak in 3.15, which I sort of agree with. Chris thought that Ashling was too strong in 3.14, which I also sort of agree with, and I think there's the right place, in my opinion, is somewhere in between the two. Ultimately, though, this is going to be something that people that like more powerful deterministic crafting would prefer a reversion to what it was in 3.14. So I think that what Ashling should do is work as she does in 3.15, but allow you to pick whether she's going to replace a random prefix, a random suffix, or one at random of each of them on your item. And then that would give her plenty of use in crafts, would be less reliant upon being paired with metamods, but ultimately, that's just my thoughts. Other people are going to have different opinions. And I've got here metamod rant, but I already sort of had that earlier. Metamods, I just think they're so busted because they're a form of deterministic crafting, but they're a form of deterministic crafting that only works if you've got literally hundreds of exalts behind you. Otherwise, or at least at the top end, for the very top end versions of metamod crafting, you generally require hundreds, if not thousands, of exalted orbs. And then there's the middle tiers where you're using them in conjunction with Harvest, which are just really counterintuitive. Like I said, I think metamods, the game would be in a better place if metamods were gone, and then that would open up the space for some other types of deterministic crafting to be introduced. And that said, I think 3.7 era multi-modding was too powerful a deterministic crafting method, whereas some people are going to say that they liked 3.7, and some are going to say that they would prefer it to be stronger than 3.7 era multi-modding was. So there's a bit of discussion about the Atlas that came up, and this was interesting here in that there's one thing that was a little bit out of place in this, and that was discussion of character progression speed and big jumps in power. And this came up when Chris is talking about diminishing returns and the Eternal Labyrinth reward coming too late in progression. But other than that, let's just talk specifically the Atlas side of things. The Atlas shrink is going to happen in 3.16. So we're going to go from 8 regions down to 4. We're going to go from 164 maps to about 100. And there was lots of discussion about low tier maps being unrewarding and returning, and a desire to return to repeat attempts at lower tier conquerors, which Chris wasn't sure why people would want to do that. And Zizaran countered that, like, often people will be leveling a second character in a league, especially with him being a hardcore player. that definitely comes up. You get into a situation where you would like to be able to fight 2 Watchstone Baran on your new character, but you cannot take on 4 Watchstone Baran yet. So that was something that he said he'd think about, but that he'd sort of take back to the team. But that's basically all there was on that. Now, Zizaran raised a really good point about favoured map sustain coming. The favoured map system coming online too late. I agree with this. I think that you should get about that you should get your first hit of the favoured map system earlier than you do, because then you could use that to help you target the maps you're missing for later on. So hopefully they do something about that, especially with the change to 4 regions. Each region will be larger than the current regions are, and that's going to mean that it will be more difficult to get the specific maps you're missing. So hopefully they do address something there. Now, I think this is not something that was discussed, but I think that 3.16 needs to get the retired maps right. In my opinion, keep them available through Zana missions or something, but with no Atlas completion reward attached to them, or even just have them drop from various sources within the game. And this would be for divination card drops. So this would be so that, for instance, if Dark Forest was removed entirely, the coruscating elixir would not be possible to get in the game at all, because that's the only way that you can get it is as a divination card reward for turning in the, I think it's called the dragon, the divination card, whatever it is, a set of it that gives a coruscating elixir. You can't get that anyway other than the Dark Forest, or maybe stack decks, I guess. So I think that for that reason, they should keep them available. Multiplayer issues will be fixed in 3.17 with the Atlas. So this is something else that came up. My comment, though, is that this is probably going to make groups feel mandatory for power gamers and make solo play feel punishing. I really hope they can get this right. I really hope they can get it into a spot where your attitude to whether you group or not for the Atlas, at the moment, your attitude to whether to group or not in the Atlas is to say, I am not grouping. However, I'd like it to get it into a spot where you group if you want to group, you don't group if you want to be solo, and both feel equally viable. But that is an extremely difficult balance to strike. We'll have to see how it goes. There's a lot of discussion about the question of what is the average player and balance. So I've got a whole bunch of comments that you can see on screen here that came up. I think these are worth reading out. These are little snippets from the actual interview. So when balancing the game, how many hours do you expect or estimate how long it will take for a player to access Uber Elder or Maven? What's an average player in GGG's eyes? And Chris responded, had a discussion with the team on this one. The thing is, an average player of people who come to your website, the average player doesn't get through the download. If you look at players who install a game, most don't get to Brutus. Now that's because people just realize quickly, oh, this game isn't for me. It's not that the game is too hard for them. It's that they just decide, oh, look, I thought I was downloading something very different. I'm bored. Let's find something else. You know, maybe they thought, oh yeah, what I want to play is Fortnite instead. And that's fine. That's their choice as to what to play. The average player who gets past Brutus doesn't get to maps. Who is the average player we want to care about? The average player, as far as Reddit is concerned, is someone who is deep in red maps. Now, I don't agree with that. Reddit, I think, is actually very dismissive of the average player. But anyway, that's a different thing. So we want to make sure endgame is appropriate for above average players. We want to make the path of going through below average to just above average achievable. This is a bit of an unanswer, but we care about a lot of different types of players. I think this is the best answer that can be given here. I think there should be content that's catered for all sorts of groups. You know, like I generally group players into a few categories. There's the person that's trying the game. There's the person that is, you might term the weekend casual player. It's not a player that probably doesn't play in leagues because they don't feel they get far enough. These would be the people who might start in a league, then reach Katava during the next league, and, you know, maybe slowly makes progress through maps, plays lots of other games as well, or maybe just doesn't spend much time gaming in general. This sort of player they're not idiots at all. You know, a lot of people can be dismissive of them, but they don't know a lot of things about the game. They're not going to do really stupid things. So, you know, they're not going to treat fire resistance as a dump stat, or at least they're not going to keep doing that after Act 6 teaches them not to. But they're going to make mistakes in their builds, and often they're going to hit a bit of a level where their knowledge of the game is going to be a barrier to progressing further. These players probably get to 1 Watchstone Conquerors and might sort of start to brick wall there. Then you have what I would term casual endgamers. These are the players that slowly progress through all of the game. maybe need to get help a couple of times to progress past particular milestone encounters. They can probably do Eternal Labyrinth on their own, but they can't necessarily do Shaper on their own. And these sorts of players are probably, in my opinion, these probably spend the majority of hours that are played on the game. Then you have your sort of aspirational power gamers, and then you have your actual power gamers. And aspirational power gamers would be the people that can beat Shaper, can beat Elder, and don't feel afraid to give a go to an encounter like Uber Elder that maybe they won't be able to beat. And then you've got your power gamers, who are the sorts of people who by about day 10 of a league, if they've set their mind to it, have completed all of the, have completed the Feared by day 10. So that's how I would divide the player base up. The power gamers are a very small percentage, but they have a very disproportionate impact on the experience of other players because, for instance, they consume almost all of the Exalted Orbs in crafts, and so their demand ends up causing Exalted Orb prizes to go up. And then you have the sort of casual endgamers, who are the people who do the Chaos Orb recipe all the time. So there's a lot of different levels of players there, and ultimately that's my philosophy on that. But do you want the average player to be able to complete things like the Maven, Uber Elder, etc., or just a small group of players? And Chris answers, should 50% of people be able to complete the hardest content in the game? That'd be undesirable. For the people who tune into this podcast, those people should be able to see all the content in the game. If they're struggling, then yes, that's a problem. A few 100,000 people out of millions who play this league, I want them to be able to get to the end game and have a good time. So yeah, I think this is important. You can't create content that is engaging for the power gamers or even the aspiring power gamers that is even remotely accessible to the end game casual, much less the weekend casual, if you take my sort of split of the player base. I remember when I was a weekend casual player, I was the sort of player who, back in the league when Uber Atzri was added, Atzri and Uber Atzri were added, I could not get past the first gatekeeper boss within the Apex of Sacrifice. That's the twin Val Oversouls. I tried 3 or 4 times, and I kept losing the fight to the twinned Oversouls. However, there were people at that same time that were beating Uber Atzri. Not just Atzri herself, but the Uber version. And I was awed by that, but I was glad that they had content for them. People who were much better than I was back then. And I was not annoyed by the fact that Uber Atzri existed. I was glad that Atzri existed, that I had something to work at aspiring to getting better to eventually beat. And a couple of leagues later, I did beat Atzri. And then a few leagues later after that, I beat Uber Atzri as well. It took me a while, but I improved and got to the point that I could do the content that had previously been completely out of my reach. Ultimately, that I think is a much healthier environment than one where the weekend casuals are beating the hardest bosses in the game, or even just getting to them. I think that Chris's answer, though, undertunes endgame content. I'd rather the way that Uber Atzri was at release, where it was where most power gamers couldn't beat her in the first league. There were people who were beating her and who even had her on farm, but most of the best players were not among them. And then over time, people got more skilled at the fight, knowledge dribbled out, and eventually strategies for beating her became more widespread. It went from a tiny percentage of power gamers that beat her to a much wider percentage. The Feared is a lot easier than Uber Atzri was at release. A lot easier. I'd like to see something that's like Uber Atzri at release added as well. Aspirational content that you fail 20 plus times before you beat it. That's the sort of thing I'd like to see, rather than the current system where it's like you will fail content a couple of times, but you feel like you don't need to improve much to beat it. You feel like you're already sort of coming close. So there was the last thing that was discussed was defenses, and there's a plan to look into defenses in 3.16. Chris's goal is you basically feel safe when mapping, then you get complacent and you make a mistake and you die. But that you are generally pretty safe most of the time. Now, I want to make a quick comment here that is something that always draws ire when I say it, but it's still true. General player perception is that most deaths are one-shots. They aren't. Most deaths are a string of savage hits that take place within a small fraction of a second. It feels like a one-shot unless you watch it at a quarter speed. And this distinction matters because you solve it in different ways. The correct player response to actually being one-shot, and this is what the Deep Delve players do, is that they start removing life and resist items, and they replace them with both damage and probabilistic defensive layers. So if you have a look at the builds that are doing Delve Depth 6000 plus, these players will have negative resists. They will have Chaos Inoculation on the tree, and they will have like only 300 or 400 energy shield. If they get hit even in a tier 5 map, they're dead. However, they then use defensive layers like dodge and evasion, and in addition, overwhelming defense and try and one-shot enemies before they get killed themselves. That's the correct way of addressing a situation where you are being one-shot a lot. However, the correct response to being bursted down by multiple hits is cast when damage taken defenses, more hit points in the form of more buffers, more probabilistic layers, and things like that. So it's a very different approach. So Zizaran expressed an opinion that Flasks, and I think he's primarily talking about Rumi's concoction, but also Taste of Hate and the like, that these were the solution players found to weak defenses in the 3.14 era. My opinion is that as long as dodge, block, and evasion are as good as they are now, there is no solution here. Sweeping changes are needed that add to player effective hit points against one hit, whilst also capping dodge and block lower than they presently are, and addressing extreme outliers in life recovery. So that's life gain on block shields, and a couple of life gain on kill mechanics. My opinion is that 40 to 70% increase in player hit point pools alongside a 100 millisecond cooldown on life gain on hit, life gain on block. Life gain on block and life gain on kill, not a life gain on hit, that's fine. And a 60% dodge cap and block cap would be a far better situation than we've got now. Then you're still going to be in danger from swarms of smaller monsters, but it's going to be danger that's going to take a little bit longer to kill you. You're going to have longer to react to it. And so, yeah, it will basically end up being a bit more fun. And the times that you do actually get one shot, which does happen, it's just not all that common, then those points, you're more likely to survive it. I also don't like the way that there's escalating returns on player resistances and physical damage reduction. So what that means is that going from 72 to 75% is much less of an impact than going from 75 to 78. And going from 78 to 81 is a bigger impact again. Basically, every point counts for more than the one before it. And that's a different kettle of fish, but I think that that's something else that should be looked at. And really, that's also one of the problems with the extreme probabilistic layers as well. There are a couple of outlier monsters that were mentioned as well. Cirrus Influence Drox Flags being one of them, and this is just something that really should be fixed. Like monsters, these are monsters that do one-shot you, and they one-shot you without warning, and they just feel really miserable because you're running through a map and then suddenly something that's stealthed just drops on top of your head, and if you don't realize in the sort of half a second you've got to react, then you're dead. There's no real counterplay to it. So yeah, those individual monsters need to be looked at. Cirrus Influence Drox Flags being the worst of them, monsters with critical striker aura, monsters with increased physical damage, allies deal increased physical damage auras, those need to be looked at. But I think that the main problem is that because player probabilistic defenses are so high, that monsters have, that GGG have to throw more monsters at us in order for there to be any challenge at all. And then that causes a really unsatisfying situation where you can get unlucky on your dodge rolls and suddenly go from, 5,000 health with 75% dodge down to dead in, in 150 milliseconds from 4 different hits because 5 enemies fire on you at once. And even though you've got 75% dodge, 4 of them hit you because you get a bit unlucky. So anyways, that's basically all the things that came to my mind from the interview. Sorry that it did end up going so long, but it's just, yeah, there's so much that was covered. If you want to get a link to the transcription of this, I will put that down in the description below. Otherwise, may Val Orbs give interesting results, and I'll catch you around.